October 16, 1943. The sun had barely risen over Rome when the sound of boots echoed through the ancient cobblestone streets of the Jewish ghetto. SS soldiers were going door to door, dragging entire families from their homes while the city that had stood for millennia watched in frozen silence. By noon, over 1,000 Jews would be rounded up and loaded onto trains bound for Auschwitz. But here's what the history books don't tell you. While this nightmare unfolded just blocks away from the Vatican, one Irish priest was already orchestrating the most audacious rescue operation in the heart of Nazi-occupied Rome, a network so secret that even the Pope himself may not have known its full extent. This is the story of how a man with nothing but a clerical collar, a sharp wit and unshakable courage became known as the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, the priest who saved 6,500 lives right under Hitler's nose. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty was not supposed to be a hero. Born in 1898 in a small village in County Kerry, Ireland, he was the son of a golf course steward, a man who grew up playing sports and dreaming of nothing more extraordinary than serving God in some quiet parish. By 1943, he had been living in Rome for over a decade, working as a Vatican diplomat with a comfortable life inside the neutral walls of the Holy See. He was known for his love of golf, his charm, and his 6'2" frame that made him impossible to miss in a crowd. He had friends across Rome, from cardinals to cab drivers, and he spoke multiple languages with the ease of a man who genuinely loved people. He was by all accounts just another priest doing his job in the Eternal City. But on that October morning, when the roundups began, something inside O'Flaherty snapped, and the comfortable diplomat disappeared forever. Rome in 1943 was a city suffocating under the weight of German occupation. After Italy surrendered to the Allies in September, Hitler's forces had poured into the capital, transforming it from a city of art and religion into a prison watched by the Gestapo. The Vatican, technically neutral, had become an island of fragile safety in a sea of terror. Pope Pius XII walked a razor-thin diplomatic line trying to avoid provoking the Nazis while sheltering those he could behind the walls of churches and monasteries. But neutrality came at a cost: silence. The official Vatican position was one of cautious inaction. And for the thousands of Jews hiding in Rome's shadows, that silence felt like abandonment. The Gestapo chief, Herbert Kappler, a cold and calculating SS officer, had set up his headquarters just a few blocks from the Vatican, and his orders were clear: find every Jew in Rome and send them east. But Kappler didn't know that his most dangerous enemy was already living inside the Vatican, wearing a cassock and smoking a pipe. O'Flaherty had watched the occupation unfold with growing horror, and when the roundups began, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not stand by, he would not wait for permission. He would use every connection, every favor, every ounce of his Irish stubbornness to save as many lives as he could, even if it meant defying the Gestapo, risking his own life, and operating in the shadows of the very institution he served. What began as a single act of mercy would soon explode into an underground network of safe houses, forged documents, and secret escapes that stretched across Rome like invisible threads, all controlled by a priest who was about to become the most wanted man in the Nazis' crosshairs. By the end of this story, you'll discover how this Irish priest turned the Vatican into a fortress of resistance, how he outsmarted the Gestapo for nearly 2 years, and why his story was almost erased from history. This is the story they didn't want you to know. To understand how an Irish priest became the most dangerous man in Rome, you need to understand what made Hugh O'Flaherty different from every other Vatican diplomat in 1943. While most church officials were content to pray and hope for peace, O'Flaherty had spent years building something far more valuable than theological connections. He had built trust. As a Vatican official responsible for visiting prisoner of war camps across Italy, he had traveled the country meeting Allied soldiers captured by the Axis powers, delivering messages to their families, and sneaking in supplies that kept morale alive. British soldiers, American airmen, South African troops, they all knew his name. He wasn't just a priest to them. He was a lifeline, a man who showed up when everyone else had forgotten they existed. And now, with Rome under Nazi control, those same skills, that same network of trust, would become the foundation of something far more dangerous. The turning point came just days before the October roundup, when a Jewish Italian woman named Henrietta Chevalier appeared at the gates of the Vatican, desperate and terrified. Her family was in hiding, and she had heard whispers that the Irish Monsignor might help. O'Flaherty didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission from his superiors, didn't consult with the Pope's advisors, didn't weigh the political consequences. He simply said yes. Within hours, he had arranged for her family to be hidden in a convent outside the city walls. It was a small act, but it was the spark that would ignite everything. Word spread quickly through Rome's Jewish community that there was a priest who would help, a man who didn't turn people away, who didn't ask questions about religion or politics. He just acted, and once he started, he couldn't stop. O'Flaherty knew he couldn't save everyone alone, so he began recruiting. His first allies were other priests and nuns, men and women who shared his conviction that silence in the face of evil was a sin worse than breaking diplomatic protocol. But he didn't stop there. He reached out to Italian aristocrats who despised Mussolini, to Swiss guards who were willing to look the other way, to janitors and cooks and drivers who had access to places that priests did not. He even enlisted a wealthy Irish-born singer named Delia Murphy, the wife of the Irish ambassador, who used her diplomatic immunity to smuggle forged documents and money across the city in her handbag. Together, they formed what would later be called the Rome Escape Line, a shadow network that existed in whispers and coded messages operating just feet away from Gestapo headquarters. But the network needed more than brave hearts. It needed infrastructure. O'Flaherty transformed churches, convents, and monasteries across Rome into safe houses, hiding Jewish families in attics, basements, and behind false walls. He forged identity papers that turned Jews into Catholics overnight, complete with baptismal certificates that no Nazi officer could dispute. He bribed guards, paid off informants, and used his diplomatic status to walk freely through checkpoints that would have meant death for anyone else. And he did it all while maintaining his cover as a mild-mannered Vatican diplomat, attending dinners with Nazi officers, smiling politely and memorizing every detail of their routines so he could exploit their weaknesses later. The operation grew faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, O'Flaherty was helping hundreds of people, and the numbers kept climbing. But with every life saved, the risk grew exponentially. The Gestapo was watching. Herbert Kappler, the ruthless SS chief who had ordered the roundups, began hearing reports of a tall Irish priest who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, a man who was making fools of the most feared intelligence network in Europe. Kappler was a hunter by nature, methodical and patient, and he had just found his prey. The cat-and-mouse game was about to begin, and the stakes could not have been higher. Herbert Kappler was not a man who tolerated failure. As the Gestapo chief in Rome, he had built his reputation on efficiency and ruthlessness, hunting down resistance fighters and partisans with cold precision. He had turned the Villa Tasso, a beautiful Roman mansion, into a chamber of horrors where suspected enemies of the Reich were interrogated and tortured until they broke. Kappler believed that fear was the ultimate weapon, that everyone had a breaking point, and that Rome would bend to Nazi will just like every other occupied city in Europe. But now, reports were flooding his desk that didn't make sense. Jews who should have been on trains to Auschwitz were vanishing into thin air. Allied prisoners of war were escaping from camps and disappearing into the city. Someone was running an underground railroad right under his nose? And the more his agents investigated, the more one name kept appearing in their reports. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. Kappler made his move in late October. He sent agents to watch the Vatican, to follow O'Flaherty's every step, to document who he spoke to and where he went. But the Irish priest was already 3 steps ahead. O'Flaherty had informants inside the Gestapo, Italian clerks and secretaries who despised their Nazi overlords and were willing to risk everything to feed him information. He knew Kappler was watching. He knew his phones were tapped and his mail was being intercepted, so he adapted. He stopped using his real name in messages, started communicating through coded phrases that sounded like innocent church business, and began moving through Rome using disguises that would have impressed any spy agency. One day he was a laborer in workman's clothes. The next he was a street sweeper, and on special occasions he even dressed as a nun, his tall frame hidden beneath flowing black robes as he walked past German checkpoints without a second glance. But Kappler was persistent, and in November he decided to send O'Flaherty a message he couldn't ignore. Gestapo agents began raiding the safe houses, arresting priests and nuns who had been helping the network and executing anyone caught harboring Jews or Allied soldiers. The message was clear. Continue this work and everyone around you will die. For most men, this would have been the moment to stop, to retreat behind the safety of Vatican walls and save themselves. But O'Flaherty wasn't most men. Instead of backing down, he doubled his efforts. He expanded the network even further, recruiting new operatives to replace those who had been arrested, and personally visited the families of those who had been taken to promise them that their sacrifice would not be in vain. The psychological warfare between the two men escalated to the point of absurdity. Kappler, growing increasingly frustrated, did something almost unprecedented. He drew a white line on the pavement at the edge of St. Peter's Square, the exact boundary where Vatican neutrality began and his authority ended. He positioned guards along the line with orders to arrest O'Flaherty the moment he stepped across it. It was a trap, a dare, and a humiliation all at once. The priest had become so untouchable inside Vatican territory that the only way to catch him was to wait for him to make a mistake. But O'Flaherty turned Kappler's trap into theater. Every evening as the sun set over Rome, he would appear at the top of the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, standing just inches from the white line, smoking his pipe and staring directly at the Gestapo agents below. He would wave at them, smile, and then disappear back into the Vatican. It was psychological warfare at its finest, a daily reminder that Kappler, for all his power, could not touch him, but the white line was more than just a taunt. It represented the fragile boundary between life and death for thousands of people hiding across Rome. As long as O'Flaherty stayed inside, he was safe. But his work required him to leave, to move through the city to coordinate rescues and deliver forged papers. And every time he crossed that line, he was gambling with his life. O'Flaherty's escapes became the stuff of legend. He developed a repertoire of disguises so convincing that even people who knew him personally would walk right past him on the street without recognition. His favorite was dressing as a coal merchant, his face blackened with soot, pushing a cart through the checkpoints while Gestapo agents searched for a tall Irish priest in clerical robes. He would hide messages in hollowed-out loaves of bread, smuggle forged documents in bundles of firewood, and coordinate rescue operations using the most unlikely messengers: children. Roman street kids, orphans, and runaways who knew every alley and shortcut in the city became his most trusted couriers. They were invisible to the Germans, just part of the city's background noise, and they moved through Rome like ghosts, delivering coded notes that kept the entire network functioning. But the operation wasn't just about clever disguises and narrow escapes. It required an infrastructure that was staggering in its complexity. O'Flaherty needed money, vast amounts of it, to pay for food, rent safe houses, bribe officials, and forge documents. He couldn't exactly send invoices to the Vatican treasury, so he turned to an unlikely source, the British Secret Service. Through encrypted communications smuggled out of Rome by diplomatic couriers, O'Flaherty made contact with British intelligence and made them an offer. He would shelter and protect Allied prisoners of war who had escaped from Italian camps, keeping them alive until Rome was liberated. In exchange, the British would fund his operation through secret channels. The arrangement was perfect. British gold sovereigns smuggled into Rome through Swiss banking networks began flowing into O'Flaherty's hands, and he used every penny to expand his network of safe houses across the city. The safe houses themselves were masterpieces of deception. O'Flaherty didn't just hide people in churches and convents. He hid them everywhere. Wealthy Roman families opened their palazzos to strangers, creating hidden rooms behind bookcases and false walls that could conceal entire families. One aristocratic countess turned her wine cellar into a dormitory that housed 20 Jewish refugees at a time. A monastery on the outskirts of Rome built a false floor in its chapel, creating a space where escaped Allied soldiers could hide during German inspections. And perhaps most audaciously, O'Flaherty even hid people inside the Vatican itself in apartments and offices that technically belonged to neutral diplomatic territory, but were scattered throughout buildings that the Germans regularly patrolled. He was playing a game of three-dimensional chess, moving people from location to location like pieces on a board, always one step ahead of Kappler's raids. The forged documents were another crucial piece of the puzzle, and here O'Flaherty was willing to push the boundaries of his priestly vows. He recruited a team of forgers, artists, and clerks who could replicate German military passes, Italian identity cards, and Vatican diplomatic papers with such precision that they passed inspection even under close scrutiny. Birth certificates were backdated, baptismal records were fabricated, and entire false histories were created for people who had never set foot in a Catholic church until the moment they needed one to survive. O'Flaherty rationalized it simply: if lying could save a life, then it wasn't a sin, it was a sacrament. He kept meticulous records of everyone he helped, writing names and details in a small notebook that he carried everywhere, a ledger of souls that he guarded more carefully than his own life. But the human cost of running this operation was beginning to show. O'Flaherty barely slept, surviving on a few hours of rest each night before rising to coordinate the next day's rescues. He lost weight, his face became gaunt, and his hands developed a permanent tremor from exhaustion and stress. Several times he came within seconds of being captured, once escaping a Gestapo raid by climbing out a window and scaling across Roman rooftops like a character from a spy novel. His closest collaborators begged him to slow down, to delegate more, to take fewer risks. But he refused. Every day the war continued was another day that people were dying, and he believed that if he could save just one more life, all the sleepless nights and near-death experiences were worth it. By the spring of 1944, O'Flaherty's network had grown to include over 60 safe houses and was sheltering thousands of people. But the larger it grew, the more vulnerable it became. One captured operative, one intercepted message, one moment of bad luck, and the entire operation could collapse like a house of cards, taking thousands of innocent lives with it. The breaking point nearly came in March 1944, when the Gestapo finally got their hands on one of O'Flaherty's key operatives, a young Italian priest named Father Borg, who had been running one of the largest safe houses in the city. The Germans arrested him during a routine patrol, finding forged documents hidden in his breviary. They took him to the Villa Tasso, Kappler's headquarters, and for 3 days they tortured him, demanding the names of everyone in the network, the locations of the safe houses, and most importantly, proof that O'Flaherty was the mastermind behind it all. But Father Borg never broke. Even as they beat him, even as they threatened to execute him, he gave them nothing. On the 4th day, the Gestapo released him, battered and broken, but alive, perhaps hoping he would lead them back to O'Flaherty. Instead, he went directly to a church, confessed his sins, and then disappeared into the network himself, becoming one of the hidden rather than one of the rescuers. His silence had saved hundreds of lives, but the message to O'Flaherty was clear. The Gestapo was getting closer. Kappler changed tactics. If he couldn't catch O'Flaherty through raids and surveillance, he would try to turn the people of Rome against him. The Gestapo began spreading rumors that the Irish priest was actually a British spy, that he was using humanitarian work as a cover for espionage, and that anyone who helped him was committing treason against Italy. They posted notices around the city warning that harboring enemies of the Reich was punishable by immediate execution, not just of the guilty party, but of their entire family. The psychological pressure was immense. Families who had opened their homes to refugees began to reconsider. Some safe houses closed their doors, their operators too terrified to continue. The network that O'Flaherty had built so carefully was beginning to fracture under the weight of fear. But O'Flaherty had an answer for that too. He began personally visiting every safe house operator who showed signs of wavering, not to pressure them but to release them from their obligation. He would sit with them, thank them for their service, and tell them that no one would judge them for choosing to protect their own families first. And then something remarkable happened. Almost none of them quit. Instead, seeing O'Flaherty's willingness to let them go, most of them recommitted with even greater determination. It was a masterclass in leadership, understanding that true loyalty cannot be commanded. It can only be inspired. The network held together not because people feared O'Flaherty or owed him a debt, but because they believed in what he was doing and trusted that he would never ask them to sacrifice more than he was willing to sacrifice himself. The spring of 1944 brought another challenge: food. Rome was starving. The Germans were stripping the countryside of resources to feed their war machine, and what little remained was hoarded by black marketeers who charged prices that ordinary Romans couldn't afford. For O'Flaherty's network, which was now feeding thousands of hidden refugees, the food shortage was an existential crisis. People could survive without money, without comfortable beds, without proper clothing, but they couldn't survive without food. O'Flaherty once again turned to his network of contacts, this time reaching out to farmers in the countryside who still had loyalty to the old Italy, the Italy that existed before Mussolini and Hitler. He arranged for wagons of vegetables, bread, and dried meat to be smuggled into Rome under the cover of darkness, hidden beneath loads of hay and firewood. He even convinced several monasteries to turn their gardens into vegetable farms with priests and refugees working side by side to grow enough food to keep everyone alive. The operation became a finely tuned machine. Every morning, O'Flaherty would receive reports about which safe houses needed more supplies, which refugees needed to be moved to new locations, and which Gestapo patrols were planning raids. He would then spend the day coordinating responses, sending messages through his couriers, arranging payments through his financial contacts, and occasionally venturing out into the city himself when a situation required his personal attention. Every evening he would return to his small room in the Vatican, update his notebook with the day's activities, and pray for the strength to do it all again tomorrow. But time was running out. The Allies were pushing north through Italy, and everyone in Rome knew that liberation was coming. The question was whether O'Flaherty's network could survive long enough to see it. Kappler knew it too, and he was preparing one final desperate attempt to destroy the man who had humiliated him for nearly 2 years. In May 1944, Kappler made his boldest move yet. He couldn't arrest O'Flaherty inside the Vatican, and he couldn't catch him in the streets. So he decided to do something unprecedented. He would request a meeting. Through diplomatic channels, Kappler sent word that he wanted to discuss a prisoner exchange, a legitimate humanitarian negotiation that would require O'Flaherty's presence as a Vatican diplomat. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. Kappler's plan was simple: lure O'Flaherty out of the Vatican under the pretense of official business, then arrest him the moment he stepped beyond the protection of neutral territory. Several of O'Flaherty's allies begged him not to go, warning him that it was suicide, but the Irish priest saw an opportunity. If he could meet with Kappler face to face, perhaps he could learn something valuable, some weakness in the Gestapo chief's plans that could help protect the network. Against all advice, O'Flaherty agreed to the meeting. The encounter took place in a neutral location, a small office in a building that straddled the boundary between Vatican territory and German-controlled Rome. O'Flaherty arrived dressed in full clerical regalia, his 6'2" frame making him impossible to miss, walking calmly through a corridor lined with SS guards who would have given anything to arrest him on the spot. Kappler was waiting inside, seated behind a desk, his cold eyes studying the priest like a scientist examining a specimen. For nearly an hour, the two men talked ostensibly about prisoners of war, but really engaging in a psychological duel. Kappler accused O'Flaherty of harboring enemies of the Reich. O'Flaherty calmly denied everything, maintaining his cover as a simple priest doing humanitarian work. Kappler threatened him with evidence, with witnesses, with the promise of arrest. O'Flaherty smiled and reminded him that Vatican neutrality protected him from German jurisdiction. It was a dance, each man probing for weakness, and when it ended, both walked away with a grudging respect for the other's determination. But the meeting had consequences. Kappler, unable to arrest O'Flaherty through legal means, decided to escalate. He began targeting the network more aggressively, using informants and collaborators to identify safe houses and arrest their operators. In one brutal week in late May, the Gestapo raided 8 locations: arresting dozens of people and executing 3 on the spot as a warning to others. The network was hemorrhaging, and O'Flaherty knew that if the raids continued at this pace, everything would collapse before the Allies could reach Rome. He needed to buy time, and he needed to do something that would force Kappler to divert his attention elsewhere. O'Flaherty made a calculated gamble. He began deliberately leaking false information through channels he knew were compromised, sending the Gestapo on wild goose chases across Rome. He fed them addresses of abandoned buildings, described safe houses that didn't exist, and planted rumors of a massive escape operation that was supposedly happening in the northern districts. The Germans took the bait, wasting precious resources raiding empty locations, while the real safe houses operated unmolested. It was a dangerous game because if Kappler realized he was being deceived, the retaliation would be swift and brutal. But O'Flaherty understood that every day Kappler was distracted was another day that thousands of people stayed alive. By early June, the sound of artillery could be heard in the distance. The Allies were less than 50 miles from Rome, and the entire city held its breath. Kappler's time was running out, and he knew it. In a final act of spite, he ordered his men to prepare a list of everyone suspected of collaborating with O'Flaherty's network, planning mass arrests and executions before the Germans retreated from the city. It was a race against time, and the fate of thousands hung in the balance. June 4th, 1944 dawned with an eerie silence over Rome. The artillery that had rumbled in the distance for weeks had suddenly stopped, replaced by a tension so thick you could feel it in the air. German troops were evacuating the city, loading trucks with stolen art and supplies, destroying documents and preparing to retreat north. Kappler's offices at the Villa Tassau were in chaos, with agents burning files and dismantling equipment. But even in retreat, the Gestapo chief hadn't forgotten his obsession. That morning, he gave the order for one final operation: arrest everyone on the list. SS squads fanned out across Rome with orders to raid every suspected safe house simultaneously, to capture the entire network in one coordinated strike before the Allies arrived. It was Kappler's last chance to destroy the man who had humiliated him, and he threw everything he had into it. O'Flaherty learned about the raids within minutes of their launch. His network of informants, now operating with reckless bravery, knowing liberation was hours away, sent desperate messages to the Vatican warning him that the Gestapo was coming. The priest faced an impossible decision. He could stay hidden inside the Vatican and watch helplessly as his collaborators were arrested and executed, or he could risk everything in one final gamble to save them. Without hesitation, he chose action. O'Flaherty grabbed his notebook containing the names and locations of everyone in the network, stuffed it into his cassock, and for the first time in months, he walked directly across the White Line at St. Peter's Square in broad daylight in full view of German guards who couldn't believe what they were seeing. He climbed into a waiting car driven by one of his trusted operatives and disappeared into the chaotic streets of Rome. What followed was the most audacious 12 hours of O'Flaherty's entire operation. Moving through a city that was simultaneously celebrating liberation and fleeing German retribution, he went from safe house to safe house ahead of the Gestapo raids, evacuating people minutes before the soldiers arrived. He used every trick he had learned over 2 years of cat and mouse warfare, splitting families into smaller groups to make them harder to track, moving them through sewers and back alleys, hiding them in churches that had already been searched. At one location, he arrived to find SS troops already breaking down the door. Without hesitation, he walked up to the German officer in charge, introduced himself as a Vatican diplomat investigating reports of looting, and calmly demanded to know by whose authority they were violating church property. The sheer audacity of his lie, delivered with perfect German and unshakable confidence, confused the soldiers long enough for the refugees inside to escape through a back exit. By nightfall, American tanks were rolling into Rome from the south, and the German withdrawal had turned into a rout. Kappler, realizing he had failed, gathered his remaining staff and fled the city under cover of darkness, taking with him a hatred for O'Flaherty that would last the rest of his life. But the priest wasn't celebrating yet. Even as jubilant crowds filled the streets welcoming the liberators, O'Flaherty was still working, still evacuating the last hidden refugees, still making sure that every single person in his network reached safety. He worked through the night, and when the sun rose on June 5th over a free Rome, he finally allowed himself to stop. He had done it. Against impossible odds, against the full might of the Gestapo, he had saved them all. The final tally would take weeks to calculate. But when all the names were counted, the number was staggering. 6,500 people. Jews, Allied soldiers, Italian resistance fighters, political refugees, all alive because one Irish priest refused to accept that neutrality meant doing nothing. O'Flaherty had turned the Vatican into a fortress of resistance, had built an underground railroad that operated under the noses of the most feared intelligence agency in the world, and had personally risked his life hundreds of times to ensure that not a single person was left behind. He had become exactly what the title promised, the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, the hero who saved thousands while the world looked away. The liberation of Rome should have been O'Flaherty's moment of triumph, the day when his network emerged from the shadows and received the recognition it deserved. American and British officers learning about the thousands of Allied soldiers he had sheltered wanted to throw him a parade, to pin medals on his chest, to make him a hero for the newspapers. But O'Flaherty refused all of it. He declined interviews, avoided photographers, and insisted that any credit should go to the hundreds of ordinary Romans who had risked their lives opening their homes to strangers. When a grateful British officer asked him how he had managed to save so many people, O'Flaherty simply shrugged and said he was just doing God's work, nothing more. It was vintage O'Flaherty, humble, deflecting attention, and already thinking about the next person who needed help rather than dwelling on past accomplishments. But the work wasn't finished. Rome was liberated, but the war continued to rage across Europe, and refugees were still flooding into the city from the north, fleeing the advancing front lines. O'Flaherty immediately pivoted his network from rescue operations to relief work, converting his safe houses into shelters for displaced families, and using his British funding to purchase food and medical supplies. He worked with the same intensity as he had during the occupation, as if liberation had changed nothing about his mission. His collaborators, exhausted from 2 years of living in constant fear, begged him to rest, to take time to recover, but O'Flaherty couldn't stop. For him, every refugee without shelter, every child without food was a personal failure, and he drove himself to the point of collapse trying to help them all. The toll of those years finally caught up with him in the summer of 1945. O'Flaherty suffered a stroke, his body finally rebelling against the months of sleepless nights, constant stress, and physical exhaustion. He was hospitalized for weeks. And when he recovered, he was no longer the vigorous man who had climbed across Roman rooftops and outrun Gestapo agents. His left side was partially paralyzed, and he walked with a pronounced limp. The Vatican, recognizing that he could no longer work at the same pace, quietly reassigned him to administrative duties, effectively ending his humanitarian fieldwork. For a man who had spent years in constant motion, saving lives at a breakneck pace, the forced retirement was devastating. But even from behind a desk, O'Flaherty continued to help where he could, writing letters on behalf of refugees, advocating for displaced persons, and maintaining contact with the families he had saved. And then something extraordinary happened in 1946. Herbert Kappler, the Gestapo chief who had spent 2 years trying to kill O'Flaherty, was arrested by the Allies and put on trial for war crimes, including the massacre of 335 Italian civilians in the Ardeatine caves. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in an Italian military prison. Most people expected O'Flaherty to celebrate, to finally enjoy the satisfaction of seeing his enemy behind bars. Instead, the Irish priest did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He began visiting Kappler in prison. Once a month, O'Flaherty would travel to the military prison and spend hours talking with the man who had tried to murder him, bringing him books, discussing philosophy and religion, and gradually, patiently working to save Kappler's soul the same way he had saved thousands of bodies during the war. For over 10 years, O'Flaherty continued these visits, never publicizing them, never seeking recognition for his extraordinary act of forgiveness. In 1959, on his deathbed, Kappler, the cold and ruthless officer who had terrorized Rome, converted to Catholicism, baptized by the very priest he had once hunted. It was O'Flaherty's final rescue, perhaps his most difficult one, proving that his mission had never been about revenge or glory, but about the fundamental belief that every human soul, no matter how dark, deserved a chance at redemption. Hugh O'Flaherty returned to Ireland in 1960, his health failing and his body worn down by decades of service. The Vatican gave him a quiet retirement, a modest pension, and a final assignment at a small parish in his home county of Kerry. Far from the chaos and intrigue of Rome, he moved into a simple cottage overlooking the Irish countryside, a world away from the underground networks and Nazi manhunts that had defined his life. For a man who had saved thousands, who had outwitted the Gestapo and become a legend in the resistance, his retirement was almost anticlimactic. There were no state ceremonies, no grand celebrations, no monuments erected in his honor. He simply faded back into the quiet life of an Irish country priest, saying Mass for local parishioners who had no idea that the tall, limping man at the altar had once been the most wanted person in Nazi-occupied Rome. The people he had saved, however, never forgot. Letters arrived at his cottage from around the world, from Jewish families living in Israel, from former Allied soldiers settled in America and Australia, from Italian resistance fighters who had survived the war. They wrote to thank him, to tell him about their children and grandchildren, to let him know that their lives that would have been extinguished without his intervention, were continuing and flourishing. O'Flaherty kept every letter, filing them carefully in boxes that filled his small home. He would read them on difficult days when the pain from his stroke was particularly bad, when the memories of those who hadn't made it haunted his dreams. Those letters were proof that his work had mattered, that the sleepless nights and constant fear had been worth it. But outside of the communities he had directly touched, O'Flaherty's story remained largely unknown. The Vatican, still navigating the complex legacy of Pope Pius XII's wartime silence, was uncomfortable with stories that highlighted individual priests acting independently of official Vatican policy. O'Flaherty's operation, after all, had been conducted without explicit papal approval, sometimes in direct defiance of the Vatican's stated neutrality. There was a fear that celebrating O'Flaherty too loudly would raise uncomfortable questions about why the Church as an institution hadn't done more. So his story was quietly downplayed, mentioned only in passing in official histories, relegated to footnotes, while other more politically convenient narratives took center stage. O'Flaherty died on October 30th, 1963 at the age of 65. His body finally giving out after years of declining health. His funeral was a small affair attended by local parishioners and a handful of Vatican officials. There were no heads of state, no international dignitaries, no media coverage. He was buried in a simple grave in Killarney marked with a modest headstone that listed only his name and dates. For years, his grave went largely unvisited except by locals tending the cemetery. The man who had saved 6,500 lives died in obscurity. His story known only to those who had lived it and those who had reason to remember. It seemed that history, like the Vatican, had decided that Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty was a story better left untold. But stories this powerful have a way of refusing to stay buried. In the decades that followed, journalists and historians began piecing together what had really happened in Rome during those dark years. Survivor psychontwinist writing memoirs. Documents were declassified and slowly, painstakingly, the full scope of O'Flaherty's network came to light. In 1983, a television movie titled The Scarlet and the Black brought his story to millions of viewers, with Gregory Peck portraying the Irish priest who had defied the Nazis. Suddenly, the world was asking, how had we never heard of this man? How had such an extraordinary story of courage and resistance been forgotten for so long? The answer to why O'Flaherty's story was buried for so long reveals something uncomfortable about how we remember. World War II. History tends to prefer simple narratives, clear heroes and villains, stories that fit neatly into national mythologies. O'Flaherty's story was complicated. He was an Irish priest working for the Vatican, saving Jews, Allied soldiers, and Italian resistance fighters, operating without official approval in a morally gray zone that made everyone uncomfortable. The British couldn't fully claim him because he was Irish and Catholic. The Irish couldn't celebrate him too loudly because Ireland had been neutral during the war. The Vatican was embarrassed because he had acted when they had counseled caution. And so his story fell through the cracks, remembered by those he saved, but absent from the grand narratives of the war that dominated history books for decades. But O'Flaherty's legacy lives on in ways that transcend monuments in history books. Every person he saved went on to build lives, have children, create families that exist today because one man refused to stand by while evil consumed the world around him. Researchers estimate that O'Flaherty's 6,500 rescues have resulted in over 100,000 living descendants today. An entire community of people whose existence is a testament to his courage. In Israel, he is honored at Yad Vashem among the righteous among the nations, non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. In Rome, the street leading to the location where he operated during the war was renamed in his honor. And in Ireland, a memorial stands in Killarney, finally giving him the recognition his own country denied him during his lifetime. What makes O'Flaherty's story so powerful is not just the scale of what he accomplished, but the motivation behind it. He wasn't a trained intelligence officer. He wasn't a professional resistance fighter, and he wasn't seeking glory or recognition. He was simply a man who saw people suffering and decided that doing nothing was not an option. In a world that often feels overwhelmed by injustice, where individuals wonder if their actions can possibly make a difference, O'Flaherty's story is a reminder that one person acting with courage and conviction can change the course of history. He didn't have an army. He didn't have political power. He didn't even have official approval from his own church. All he had was a network of ordinary people who believed that protecting the innocent was worth risking everything. The lesson of O'Flaherty's story extends beyond World War II, in every era. In every crisis, there are moments when individuals must choose between safety and conscience, between following orders and doing what's right. O'Flaherty chose conscience. He chose to act when the institution he served counseled caution. He chose to risk his life daily when he could have remained safe behind Vatican walls. And perhaps most remarkably, he chose forgiveness, spending the final years of his life trying to redeem the soul of the man who had tried to kill him. That kind of moral courage, that depth of compassion, doesn't fade with time. It becomes more relevant, more necessary with each passing generation. So the next time you hear someone say that one person can't make a difference, remember the Irish priest who stood at the edge of St. Peter's Square, smoking his pipe and staring down the Gestapo. Remember the 6,500 lives he saved, the 100,000 descendants who exist because of his courage, and the profound truth at the heart of his story. That heroism isn't about power or position. It's about choosing humanity over fear, compassion over complicity, and action over silence. That's the legacy of Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican. And that's a story that deserves to be told, remembered, and celebrated for generations to come.